welcome to Tax Chat from the Tax and Financial Planning Committee of Sheehan and Company. My name's Christian, and I'm joined today by Michael Volpe, and we're here to discuss the life cycle of a non-for-profit corporation. Today, we'll be chatting about what you need to start a non-for-profit corporation in New York State, what forms you need to file, and any ongoing filing requirements. Then we'll be chatting about how to dissolve a non-for-profit, the forms required, and any additional steps that are needed when things don't go according to plan. First, let's discuss the incorporation process for a non-for-profit corporation in New York State. The first step in the incorporation process is choosing a name. You can check the online databases such as guidestar.org to check if your name is available. A corporation may reserve the name it intends to use by filing an application with the Secretary of State of New York. The next step of the formation of a corporation is the filing of a certificate of incorporation, which may also be referred to as articles of incorporation, articles of association, or a charter. You file this with the Secretary of State of New York as well.
Now, Christian, this sounds great and all, but how is the IRS keeping track of all these organizations? Is there like a numbering system or anything like that?
Well, every corporation must obtain an employee identification number, or EIN, from the IRS, even if it doesn't have employees. The EIN is a unique number that identifies the corporation to the IRS, as well as other federal and state agencies. Among other things, an EIN is generally required to open a bank account and is required to apply for tax-exempt status. To apply for an EIN, the corporation, after its incorporation, must complete IRS Form SS4, the application for Employer Identification Number.
Now, Christian, for all these tax-exempt entities, what governs how they operate and what they can and can't do,
Well, a corporation's bylaws, while not required for the incorporation process in the beginning, will be needed to be adopted before the corporation submits its IRS Form 1023 application for exemption from the IRS. Bylaws are the internal rules by which a corporation is governed. The corporation's bylaws should provide sufficient flexibility for the board of directors to govern the corporation and the officers to manage the corporation. Generally, the bylaws contain provisions relating to the election of directors and officers, the powers of its members, directors and officers, quorum and voting requirements, processes for dealing with conflicts of interest, and provisions for the indemnification of officers and directors. Corporations incorporated in New York must adopt a conflict of interest policy that meets certain requirements of New York state law. In order to apply for tax-exempt status under Code Section 501c3, the corporation must submit to the IRS a completed IRS Form 1023, the application for recognition of exemption. Corporations that are tax-exempt under Code Section 501c3 are classified as either public charities or private foundations. Private foundations are generally funded by a limited group of donors, i.e. one family or a handful of individuals or one company, such as the Gates Foundation. Private foundations are subject to very strict rules that can limit their operations. Public charities are further divided into several categories: organizations that engage in inherently public activities, such as churches, schools, and hospitals; organizations that receive a substantial part of their support from the general public; organizations that are funded primarily from the receipts from the performance of their exempt functions, such as theaters or museums; organizations that support other organizations discussed before; and are structurally linked to them. The public support tests that must be met on an annual basis for organizations that qualify are based on mathematical calculations, with new public charities given an initial 5-year grace period during which they do not need to meet the applicable public support test.
Now, Christian, let me just stop you for 1 second. So you submit that 1023 to the IRS, then what happens?
Well, upon receipt of the corporation's IRS Form 1023, the IRS will send the corporation an acknowledgement letter, confirming receipt of the IRS Form 1023 and informing the corporation about the review process and timing. The IRS may request one or more supplemental submissions of information prior to making a determination about the corporation's application. It can also take anywhere from 4 to 12 months for the IRS to review and respond to an IRS Form 1023 application for exemption. And if the IRS finds that the corporation qualifies for tax-exempt status, it will send the corporation a determination letter. The letter will state, among other things, the effective date of the corporation's tax-exempt status, the corporation's classification as a public charity or private foundation, and the corporation's obligation to file an annual IRS Form 990, or 990-PF in the case of a private foundation. As we mentioned before in the incorporation process, you will file a Certificate of Incorporation with New York Department of State's Division of Corporations, State Records, and Uniform Commercial Code. Now that we have obtained our determination letter from the IRS, we can file for tax-exempt status in New York State. To file for exemption from New York corporate franchise tax, you will need to file Form CT-247. And along with Form CT-247, you will need to include the organization's IRS determination letter, articles of incorporation, and bylaws. After filing for tax-exempt status with the Department of Taxation and Finance, you will need to register as a charity with the New York Attorney General's office. In the online portal for the New York State Attorney General, you can file an online New York Char 410 to register with the New York State Attorney General's office. Some organizations may be exempt from this registration requirement. The final stage to set up your New York State non-for-profit is to apply for exemption from sales tax. The state and city of New York impose sales and use taxes on many items that the corporation may need to purchase. The corporation should prepare and file New York State Form ST 119.2 with the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance to apply for an exempt organization certificate to establish the corporation's exemption from these sales and use taxes.
Now, Christian, we do all these steps. We're all set up and ready to go in New York State. Is there any ongoing annual filing requirements we need to complete?
Yes. For public charities, you must annually file a New York State Char 500 on the online portal for the New York State Attorney General's office. This is your annual filing requirement for New York State nonprofits.
Well, Christian, thank you for letting us know how to set up your non-for-profit. Now I'm going to tell you how to dismantle it and dissolve it and take it down. So this is actually something I actually went through with a client recently, helping them dissolve their non-for-profit. It started off, at this point, it's June 2023. Started off fairly straightforward. We filed the final 990 easy. Of course, when you file the final 990 EZ, there's a couple different things you need to do for the final form. In my case, it was a short year. It was January 1st, 2023 to June 30th, 2023. And as you may know, the final return is still due 5.5 months after operations cease. So for a June 30th year end, the final 990 was still due November 15th. And as you know, also with our software programs, 2023 forms aren't available yet. So what do? We had to prepare this final 2023 return on 2022 forms. We took the normal steps for a final 990. On page 1, part A, we made sure to use 2023 short year dates on the 2022 forms. On page 1, part B, we checked final return / terminated. On part 4, question 31, we checked that box yes. That asks, did the organization liquidate, terminate, or dissolve and cease operations, which leads you to file Schedule N, part 1. We completed Schedule N, liquidation, termination, dissolution, or significant disposition of assets. And then we also added a short year explanation to part 6 of supplemental information of Schedule A. And then even though we are doing a 2023 return on 2022 forms, we were still able to e-file. But then the last part of filing that file 990 for the federal requirements is that we need that special attachment. That special attachment being a certified copy of the articles of dissolution or merger approved by the appropriate state authority, or need to submit a copy of the resolution of the governing body approving plans of liquidation, termination, dissolution, or merger. But then we run into the issue where, because in New York State, the Attorney General requires the final 990 just to approve the articles of dissolution, you can't attach articles of dissolution to the 990 if it needs to get approved by the Attorney General. They require each other. So therefore, we had to go with the second option. It's just the resolution of the governing body approving the plans of liquidation, termination, dissolution, or merger. Another key to the dissolution process, make sure you have a good attorney. So we had the plan of dissolution. It was drafted by the attorney. We had it signed by the treasurer of our organization, and it also had to be notarized. This is all before we could just attach it to the tax return. And we still are on the federal dissolution. We're not even on New York State yet. So we had the attorney prepare the plan. We obtained a unanimous written consent from the board to adopt the plan signed by every single member of the board. At the same time, the attorney also began working on that certificate of dissolution.
So now that you've done all of this for the federal dissolution, what steps are required to dissolve your non-for-profit in New York State?
Hope you have some time, because we're going to get into it. So as you know, the New York State Chart 500, you mentioned they recently switched to the online portal submission format. Well, it turns out when I went to go do that for the entity I was working with for the final year, that only applies for calendar year. Now, I was on a fiscal year. It was January 1st to June 30th, 2023. So on the New York State's website, it said you had to request a paper return via email to the New York State Attorney General's office. So of course, I submitted that email requesting my paper form. This point now, we started in June 23. We're in August of 2023. After 2 weeks of no response from the New York State Attorney General's office, I got on the phone and I called them. They told me that they could find my email, they see my request, and they were working on it. So I was patient with them. 2 more weeks, still no word from them. So I call back again. They tell me that paper form I was looking for wouldn't be available until 2024. So, hang up the phone a little frustrated. Less than a week later, they actually emailed me back and sent me that exact paper form I was looking for, that they said wouldn't be ready until 2024. At this point now, we're in mid-September. So then I completed that final paper, Char 500, and I was able to get that to the attorney we were working with, and they were able to send the final packet as requested by the New York State Attorney General's office. It included, prior year 990s and Char 500s for the last couple years, our plan of dissolution, our draft of the, that certificate of dissolution. And this is just to get approval from the Attorney General's office to dissolve the tax-exempt entity. That submission PDF was 118 pages. So the attorney submits to the Attorney General's office, and then by the end of September, we finally receive word from the Attorney General's office that they were processing her application. They come back to us, and now they requested a final accounting, which is just something we prepare in Excel. Basically, they want to see what happened with the assets, the remaining cash in the bank at the end of 12/31/2022, just to see, where that money's going and just make sure it's not going to the wrong people. Now, we prepared that Excel accounting. They also want to know what we have in our reserve fund. This is part of the plan of dissolution. Every tax-exempt entity has a little reserve fund just for last-minute administrative expenses. They wanted to know what we were doing with that money as well. So we do that. We prepare the Excel. We let them know where every dollar goes, attorney fees, final grants the organization gave out, and we submit that to the Attorney General's office. So after this step, by now it's late October. Obviously, we run into our October 15th filing deadline, so we get a little busy. This maybe wasn't, the first thing on the top of our plates at the moment. The Assistant Attorney General, after submitting that accounting, actually had some revisions for our certificate of dissolution. We had to fix, a date they wanted us to change. They wanted us to change a checkbox. So after that, we had to actually resubmit the certificate of dissolution. The treasurer had to re-sign, and then we had to resubmit the form. At this point now, we're at end of October. So now we're at mid-November. We finally receive approval from the New York State Attorney General's office. If you think that approval was it to dissolve, we're not even close to being done. So the next step, now that we've dealt with the Attorney General's office, is to now deal with the Department of Taxation and Finance. This should have been received, that approval, after we filed the final return. So I call New York State to see what's the holdup here. Turns out, as you mentioned, that CT 247, which is a step in the formation process, that adds the application, as you know, for exemption from corporate franchise tax for a non-for-profit organization. Turns out the entity I was working with never filed that along the when we did the formation. It's a common pitfall. As I was told by New York State, this is actually a common misstep, which is why I'm glad you mentioned it. They see this all the time. So what do? I had actually prepared this form retroactively, going back to the date of the IRS determination letter. I had to prepare the CT 247, which also requires a listing of all the board members and a description of their duties, and then I also had to send them with that a copy of the IRS determination letter that shows the effective date, which allows it to be retroactive to when it should have been submitted. So all this did in our timelines just kind of caused some delays in the dissolution process. But also, while this was happening at the same time, that final short year CHAR 500, which I had to get the special paper forms for, was just sent back to our office. And it said that, we submitted the enclosed paper filing to fulfill the annual financial report. However, they no longer accept the paper submissions, and that we all had to submit by the portal, which I couldn't believe. I had talked to multiple agents on the phone, and they're the ones who told me that this had to be filed by paper. I immediately go back to the agent who told me that this had to be paper and sent me the paper forms and said, hey, what's going on here? She gets back to me immediately and she says, sorry about this. There was a policy change, and that just to resend the same packet I sent months ago, but just print out her email saying, oh, this is allowed to be done. So at the same time, I was still taking care of that. Now at this point, we're in beginning of December. Remember, I started this back at the end of June. So I resubmit that, as the agent said. New York State accepted our CT for 247 that we submitted, and then sent their consent to dissolve from the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance. At this point now, we're in mid-December of 2023. Then our CHAR 500 that we resubmitted was accepted, and then we received a notice of closed registration file from the New York State Attorney General's office. Now you probably think we're done, but we're not. If you thought that was everything, we still got a couple more steps. So then we're still working with the attorney at this point. The attorney put together the approved certificate of dissolution by the Attorney General's office, the consent that we received from the New York State Department of Taxation and Finance, and then that notice of closed registration file from the New York State Office of Attorney General from that final Char 500. Now we were able to put this packet and all these consents together and submit to a whole new department. The New York State Secretary of State now had to get all this information as well. So at this point, the attorney submitted everything. We're at the end of December, 6 months from when we started, and we were finally dissolved in New York State and with the Fed, with the exception that the attorney had to send the New York State Secretary of State's approval and send that back to the Attorney General's. Everyone needs a copy of each other's approval, which he handled in early 2024. So now, at this point, we are finally dissolved with your tax-exempt entity.
I would like to thank you again for joining us until the end of this tax chat as we discussed the life cycle of a non-for-profit corporation in New York State. If you have any questions about this or any other tax and financial planning topics, please email us at tfpcommittee@SheehanCPA.com and we'll chat about it next time on Tax Chat.
Go out and start your non-for-profit today.